it's taken a while for me to sort of trust that I don't have to always be operating from a place of deep trauma or something
Mm-hmm.
in my work as an artist. The source materials that I have available to me are worthy of spinning into gold.
Welcome back, friends. I'm Kristen Martin, and this is Torches. Today we have the prolific Misha Chowdhury. Misha is an award-winning, many-tentacled writer and director whose work has exploded in the last 2 years with productions all over the city and all over the country. I'm really excited for this conversation. Welcome, Misha.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, thank you.
Of
So,
course.
how did you come to be in downtown performance?
Oh, wow. I was just talking to somebody about the fact that I feel like this life was not preordained for me. My parents are both physicists. I'm an only child of two physicists. And the arts were always a huge part of my life, but I've always been adjacent to a sort of like scholastic academic universe. I came to New York pretty late for people that come to New York. I came on the verge of 30 to grad school at Columbia. And I knew that I was always, that many tentacled word, at some point I just sort of like threw into my bio, but it always was, like I applied to MFA programs in directing and playwriting and poetry. And to me, theater has always kind of functioned like, or has always been the umbrella under which all of the expressive sort of forms that I'm interested in get to sort of coexist. So directing, I think I had a like spidey sense that I wanted to get an MFA in directing because it would allow me to take the leap into the sort of entrepreneurial life that theater requires and asks
Mm-hmm.
for, but that was not endemic to my own family life. So yeah, it feels strange to say that I've been here in New York, making work for more than a decade now. And and I didn't even really know that it wasn't like I sought out, I didn't know that what I was making was, uh, was in the realm of like, I wasn't like, oh, there's uptown and downtown. I just became aware. I still am only, that's the universe that I thought was theater, downtown performance. I didn't really know, like I was like, only as of this past year, I'm like, oh, there's like, there are these like Broadway, off Broadway houses like MTC and Roundabout, and all of that was very unfamiliar to me. I only
Mm-hmm.
The theaters that nourished me when I first came here to the city after when I sort of graduated from grad school were theaters like here and Soho Rep and New York Theater Workshop and the Bushwick Starr and Ars Nova, and to me those were the big like fields of dreams that I aspired to. And it's only now that I sort of understand the whole landscape and how they are situated within that landscape. But those were the spaces that allowed me to play at a time when I was still figuring out what kinds of work I wanted to make.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You do the unusual thing of collaborating with people very close to you, like your partner and your
Yes.
mom.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why do you enjoy those collaborations?
I don't even know if it was sort of like how intentional it is and was, other than I it is true that I collaborate with people that are close to me, but I also think the reason those projects have happened the way that they've happened is that I am often choosing collaborator first and then what is it that we're making together.
Mm.
Even with, I mean, obviously I've done that with my partner Cameron, who's a video artist, and with my mom, who's a physicist. But even before that, when I was making work it was like, oh, this is a composer that I want to work with. What is it that we're going to make together? This is a painter that I want to work with. What is it that we, I think also about, I've worked with Lightning Rod Special, and it wasn't, it was sort of like, I was like, oh, these are people that I'm interested in. And then it was a question of sort of finding our way to what the most interesting, challenging project in the space between us would be. And so I think the reason that I've worked with Cameron and my mom is that they operate so differently in the world than I do. And so it was exciting to try and see what a video artist and I, now it seems like that is a large part of my work, but I'd never worked with video before Cameron and I had worked together. And so in those kinds of collaborations with people that are dear to me, I feel like it sort of expands my own box of paints.
What for you is like a moment of pure joy in your work? What has been a moment of pure joy?
I'm trying to think of a very specific moment, but it's only getting to do Public Obscenities really was this enormously joyous thing, because it wasn't that I sought out. I was writing a thing that I wanted to write, and I didn't understand what how that would sort of land on me in my life. And it's strange that this is where my brain is going in response to a question about pure joy, but that play was inspired by this voice memo that I had recorded of my uncle back in Calcutta, who had never left India, never got to come and see the work that I did here in the States. And he, in a strange turn of events, passed away right as the play closed at Soho Rep. But getting to see his, while the show was running at Soho Rep, I was back in India for a cousin's wedding, and he was in the hospital, and I was getting to show him production photos of this play that was inspired by this dream that he had and asked me to sort of like manifest something out of. And
That's
just
beautiful
yeah,
that you got to share it with him in the hospital that way.
100%. And he was like giving me, he was like, that is the color of green that I had seen in my dream in her sari. And so just, it wasn't that I set out to create this thing that would carry on that I would, it almost feels like I get to sort of continue to collaborate with him through the play. And that wasn't what I sought out to do, but that's what it feels like happens so often in making theater for me. It's that like what the impact is in my own life is something that I couldn't have really fathomed before. It like turns it to its own sort of like creature that lives a life, and then like I get to continue to sort of it nourishes me and I nourish it. And so that's a thing that I still think back on, that we got to have that moment together.
You've spoken about ritual performance as a way to process life. Is this related to that, or is that a different thing that you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think there was a time when I approached it explicitly, that there was a time in my making when I approached what I was making from a place of how it would impact me and the people that were making it first, rather than how it would rather than thinking first about the audience. And I think that was when I was using the word ritual most explicitly. But I've found that, I think Rheology, this piece that I did with my mom that here commissioned, and that is probably the most that is the most effective ritual that I have made as a theater maker. It was because I was thinking so actively about what my mom and I could do together with an audience, that which I think it feels truer to the word ritual now. I think I used to think about ritual as like it's it was almost sort of antagonistic towards the audience and more about this sort of like invisible thing that was happening between the folks who were making the thing. But then I think about like, you know, the rituals that true rituals take deep care of the audience and take into consideration what the audience, if I think about like, you know, even just going to a church service. Now I understand that like my role as sort of an audience proxy because I am a director by training has taught me a lot about how to I feel like the ritual works better on me now because I don't know how it's going to work on me. And my job is to sort of like create the circumstances for something to happen. And then what's going to happen is the sort of unknowable ritual.
How do you channel the audience as the audience proxy to like create what you're making? I mean, and to think about how that's going to impact them?
That's the thing that feels so mysterious, I think.
How do you know it's working? You know?
Yeah, I think it really is just about. Obviously, I only can attend to like how a thing lands with me, and I'm paying attention to the bodies around me when I'm watching a show once we're in previews. But I think I have spent a lot of time sort of honing my I think I've become much more of a listener as a director than I say a lot less than I used to when I was younger, because I think the best thing that I can do is try and engage in the thought experiment of if I were to be watching this thing for the first time, am I like, when am I leaned in? When does it lose me? And that, I think I tend to work in a really granular way around those kinds of questions. Like, it's like, oop, that thing lasted for a second too long, and now the rubber band has snapped. But it is just about like the good old fashioned sort of wisdom that I think is part of a lot of directing training, which is how do you watch the thing that's in front of you and not watch it for the note that you gave. How do you like see the really be an observational artist and react and respond rather than sort of like try and project the hologram that's on your brain into the space in front of you.
Your work is in a lot of unusual forms, you know, the multiple languages with a big challenge to English-speaking audiences as your primary audience, or having your mom on stage who isn't a performer. She's an accomplished lecturer, but not a performer.
Right.
Like, these are risky things that you're doing. You once said, I don't think we're going to revitalize the theater by playing it safe. So can you share what interests you about risk, or a big risk that you've taken?
Yeah. I mean, the projects that you just described are certainly the biggest risks I've taken. I think, I don't, again, I think a lot of it has to do with, how do I say this? Like, it was an enormous risk to write a play that was 50% in Bengali when I'd never seen a production that was super titled to that degree, especially this kind of a sort of hyper naturalistic play. There were so many risks involved around just like, would I be able to find a cast that was able to perform this show? And I don't think I like, it's less about like what's the risky thing that I can do and more about not shying away from the thing that I am attracted to, and I just happen to be attracted to by virtue of who I am and what is sort of true to my world, things that are riskier in the landscape of what theater has been doing. I think language is... I'm a multilingual person, and I've always been that. That's sort of the core of who I am. And therefore I don't feel like I can make without speaking the many languages that feel truest to me. And that is, like, it feels like at some point I had to contend with the fact that I was an only child of two physicists, so the language of physics needed to sort of like show up in my work. So that, working with my physicist mom, who's never performed before, wasn't about the sort of challenge or the risk of it so much as it felt sort of crucial to like move through that to sort of like bring that part of myself to my work at some point, and not shying away from like how do we make those languages work in the theater.
You've spoken before about expectations that are projected onto artists of
Yeah,
color
totally.
and who they're supposed to be as an artist or what they're supposed to make.
Yeah.
So how have you interacted with that or worked against it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a thing that I've thought so much about over the course of the last, I would say, 6 or 7 years. Yeah, I think I have, well, what do I want to say? I think I have felt a great deal of, I have felt many expectations projected onto me. I was just talking about this with Priya Krishna the other day, who is a new friend and a food writer that I'm sure many of you know. But we were talking about we were talking about how we are now hungry for example, immigrant stories or children of immigrant stories that don't that sort of peel away the layers of this. We have told the stories that were expected of us around. For example, I feel like people expect me to have had a hard childhood, being the only brown kid growing up in Wayland, Massachusetts. Sure, like I could. There are true things to be said about the loneliness is endemic to being the only brown kid in an all-white town. But the sort of full true story of my life growing up in that town has more to do with how that town brought me to theater. Code switching, for example, is often talked about as a hardship or a sort of like a labor that we would rather not engage in. But to me, my many languages and the reality of my life often feels, those things feel like resources, the things that people expect me to narrate as hardships or things that I was the victim of usually show up in. I mean, I've led a pretty charmed life, you know what I mean? And I think like as a gay brown artist, that people don't really know what to do with the fact that I don't have a sob story about those things. But I still want to but obviously those things are who I am. So I have different stories to tell. And I think the only way I don't feel like it's me really pushing back against those expectations and just sort of ignoring them and coming to a sort of, it's taken a while for me to sort of trust that I don't have to always be operating from a place of deep trauma or something in my work as an artist, but that like I have that the source materials that I have available to me are worthy of spinning into gold or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you have that experience in the culture or in with institutions about the kind of things that they would like to talk to you about making? Or how could you define that a bit in terms of relationship to institutions?
Yeah. I think it is both interpersonal and in relationship to institutions. I think I probably have. There are many instances of sort of experiencing that, just sort of like in conversation, feeling as though a lot has been assumed, and that in order to tell the truth, I would need to like stop the train and back up and just sort of reorient the conversation. And oftentimes I didn't want to do that. So it was sort of like unspoken assumptions just sort of went unspoken. And those are with folks who work in institutions, but also fellow artists.
Right.
The way that I felt the pressure most acutely probably was just in a sort of just in seeing what was being programmed broadly around me and feeling as though, these patterns suggest that this is what is wanted from people that look like me. It's not so much that it was like, no one's ever said to me, we want X from you.
Right.
But I have felt that perhaps the reasons behind the work that I had been seeing on stage, having been programmed, spoke to trends in interests.
Yes.
Said more to me about what institutions wanted from
Right,
artists
like
of
the
color.
celebration of trauma porn, for example, and
Or even just like I feel like for a while there was I don't even know how to describe it, but a lot of like a kind of sort of like masochistic berating of the audience, a kind of didactic, like there were, and some of these were plays that there were plays that sort of engaged in that kind of direct address that I loved, and others that that weren't for me. But it was interesting to notice that there were many plays over the course of a few years where I was like, there's a desire to be like to self-flagellate a little bit for us as audience members in the theater, to sort of like to do penance by going to the theater, which felt like one of the trends that I was noticing. And that's just one of many things that I had noticed were sort of like metastasizing across the field.
Yeah. Could you speak about institutions or producers and how they've supported or not supported your work?
I feel enormously lucky, and that's another one of I think that I have been so held by institutions, because to me the theaters that I've worked in haven't felt like grand institutions. They are theaters with a staff of like that I can count on 2 to 3 hands, you know what I mean?
Right.
And so I feel like I have had I came out of grad school and I did New York Theater Workshop's 2050 Fellowship. I did Soho Rep's Writer-Director Lab, Ars Nova's Makers Lab, which was only in its second year, the Public's Devised Theater Working Group. There was, at that time, it felt like a really robust set of developmental opportunities and labs for artists who were trying to, and also it was a moment in which there was an appetite for what now we sort of like call multi-hyphenate, but that was a word I heard for the first time maybe in 2017, and that I came out of grad school still with the understanding that folks wouldn't want that institutions wouldn't be interested in an artist that was spreading themselves too thin, and that I shouldn't be like, oh, I'm also a writer. And so, but then pretty quickly, it felt to me as though there was an appetite for that kind of an artist, especially in those kinds of institutions. And I am, here and Soho Rep. These are organizations, the Bushwick Starr, Playwrights Horizons now, and I really have to like give props to Soho Rep for like what I was basically funded for 3 years working on this one project, which is such a rarity, especially for playwrights. I now understand that I had that kind of like full holistic support, and financial support.
Yeah, could you explain for folks listening
Yeah,
about that program
yeah,
that they launched during COVID? Yeah.
totally. Yeah, so in 2020, in the fall of 2020, while theaters were still shut down, I got a call from Sarah Benson and Merope and Cynthia saying they wanted to chat, and they shared with me that they had decided to funnel the resources that they would have put towards the 2020-21 season, simply towards bringing 8 artists, 2 directors, 2 playwrights, 2 designers, 2 actors, onto salary for a full season, for a full 10 months, simply to be in thought partnership with the theater as they tried to find their way out of the pandemic. And also just to make a project of their own choosing. So that was, I had never had a salary and benefits simply to sit and work on something for a year. And then that is where I began to write Public Obscenities. And it really was so I have found that those kinds of like financial structures have a huge impact on like how and what I make. And I could speak about that in the context of Rheology too, but like what I make is shaped by how I am supported in making the thing. And I don't know that I ever would have written a play with 7 characters that required the kind of casting that it required, that Public Obscenities required, had I not already had I not had the opportunity to write in the way that I was writing, but also they had committed to producing that play before they knew how many people were in the play, what the play would. They'd committed to producing that play when they'd read 15 pages of it, none of which I think showed up in the final draft of the piece. And so that kind of I've had the great privilege of like institutions taking wild leaps with me, which creates a kind of solid ground underneath me and allows me to sort of leap higher, I think.
That's interesting. And do you think that that kind of foundation, you're saying it encourages risk? Does it also help you, if you're failing, be able to keep going? Or does how does failure come into that?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think Rheology is an interesting example of, like the story of that piece is I'm trying to figure out a way to talk about it in a way that feels both honest and not cynical. But like that piece really only exists because of the HARP program at here, right? Like it's a thing. At that time in my life, I was like dreaming up projects to apply to things with, right? And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I knew I felt that here was the kind of place where that might be interested in this sort of strange interdisciplinary collaboration with my physicist mom. And so I sort of brought that kernel of an idea to here because like that kind of conversation with institutions hasn't to me always felt like it hasn't felt like an unuseful limitation. It's felt like a sort of productive limitation in some ways. But I think you were talking about failure. I think throughout the process of Rheology, I think I had like proposed this thing. I didn't really know what I was trying to do with it. Like I
Right.
knew there was something there and that I wanted to collaborate with my mom, but somehow it wasn't congealing into a dramaturgy that felt like um, the kind of thing that I was interested in making. And then so much of what the piece became uh, actually was a function of the strange procrastination that I was engaged in while working on that piece. And I think that has to do with the fact that, like, the structure of that residency is multi-year, and that there is, like, had I had to have made that piece in a year, I think I would have made like a nice concert memoir with my mom. But it's only because it took 5 years and that there was an institution and then multiple institutions supporting that piece over the course of a 5 year period that, like, I went from being 35 to 40 and my mom went from being 65 to 70, and then suddenly it was like, oh, this is a piece about aging and like running out of time. And so it feels like the material of the pieces that I make is fed by the sort of like support structures. And when it felt as if it weren't for the fact that there were institutions that I was in a kind of committed relationship with, that project might never have come to fruition. So it does feel like when I'm like feeling like I'm coming up against blocks, if I'm in conversation with institutions that are truly supporting me with resources and with thought partnership, that I can like pick myself back up off the floor and like try again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've just talked about this a little, but is access to resources changing the way you make work?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Though I wouldn't say it's changed, and I am, genuine. Like I am making more money this year than I've ever made in my life, and I'm sort of coming into an awareness of the landscape of theater beyond the institutions that have nourished me my whole sort of creative life. And I don't think I'm necessarily making differently or choosing different things to make. But I do feel like the resources, I do feel like I wouldn't say, for example, like I wouldn't say that I directed Prince Faggot differently than I would have. It wasn't like, oh, here's the size of the budget, therefore I'm not gonna like make a thing to fill the container that is the budget,
Uh-huh.
that I have resources that I have available to me. I think like I have always advocated for like the thing that I want to see, and then that thing has managed to happen insides of various differently sized boxes.
Right.
And so, even public obscenities inside of Walker Space versus at Woolly Mammoth and TFANA, the piece grew to fill those spaces in terms of the physical resources of the theater. But I wouldn't say that that more resources necessarily felt like I had to sort of like make expensive things.
Yeah.
But I do feel like the personally, the resources that I am being afforded by getting to work, or like the kind of like I have time now. It's always felt like the greatest resource is the time. I had a year to write Public Obscenities. And so that was a function of the pandemic and project number one at Soho Rep. That's not going to be the case going forward in my life when I have nothing else to work on and I'm getting paid to do just this one thing. But it does feel as though like when I'm getting when my time is valued in a particular kind of way, and I feel like it's being valued in a way now that I've never sort of experienced before. that I like can work on many things at once rather than one thing at once. And those things are still the things that I have always wanted to make. It's not like I've dreamt them up now that I have sort of, I don't know, the opportunity to play in bigger houses or something. But yes, I would say that like the greatest gift that comes out of those sort of more resources is just time to like work on all the things that I didn't have the chance to work on when I wasn't getting paid to do them.
Yeah. How is it for you working as a director now? You've been making your own work. You've always done both, but there's
Yeah.
been a lot of
Yeah.
success on the projects that are completely you're the auteur of, you're the writer director of.
Totally.
And you've also had an incredible year this year with directing work, The Gospel at
Yeah.
Little Island and Prince Faggot. So how is that for you as a director to step in on those
Yeah.
projects where your role is different?
Yeah. I mean, it's a little funny to have my training is as a director, and playwriting was the thing that was new to me. But Public Obscenities was really my first like big debut as a director as well. It was my playwriting debut for sure, 100%. But I think a lot of folks were like, "Oh, how did you choose to direct your own play?" But the reality was, it was more for me a question of how did I choose to write
write a
myself
play.
something to direct. It's true that I sort of like my first big thing as a off-Broadway director was my own play. But that was new to me, and I felt more comfortable collaborating with other artists as a director, even though I'd never really done that at the scale that I've had the opportunity to do this year. So it's been really satisfying to sort of move back into those kinds of collaborations, having learned what I learned from directing my own work, and getting to, it's felt kind of deliciously freeing because I'm only operating as a director on these shows. So I can really focus in on the things that I love most about directing, which are collaborating with designers and performers, and that's always been my ethos as a director. I'm not there are shows in which I really do operate as a kind of auteur by virtue of the fact that I'm wearing so many hats, but even on those shows the whole thing can change by virtue of an idea that the scenic designer has. So I think like getting to just sort of marinate in like that kind of horizontal collaboration again. Just stepping into these projects as a director has allowed me to do that in a way that I couldn't appreciate as fully when I was also performing in the work or writing the work and making changes. I can just sort of like listen to the like pantheon of folks that the dream team of folks that I've assembled on these projects and get to sort of listen and learn a little bit more.
Fantastic. When you think about downtown, how it's changed in the decade or more that you've been here,
Yeah.
do you feel like the spirit that first attracted you is still present?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, I think for me, the artists that sort of exemplified what I would describe as downtown theater are still the artists whose work inspires me the most. I think about, Peter Mills Weiss and Julia Mouncey's work, or Lightning Rod Special. I think about, but also I'm just like, my partner Cameron is a fellow at BAM this year, and we get to go to see shows at BAM for free, and I've seen everything that's in New Wave this fall. I'm still, I go to more Broadway openings than I've ever in my entire life, but like, and there are some Broadway shows that I love. And I do think that there are downtown, something that is exciting is that perhaps more than there ever was, folks that were sort of like born in the downtown theater are getting to make the sort of transition to the commercial universe in a way that is perhaps bringing those sensibilities and aesthetics to commercial theater and Broadway. But for the most part, I still, you know, I don't feel fed by what I go and see on Broadway in the way that I do when I go and see work in the spaces that were homes for me and have been homes for me. And I think in those spaces, I think most of the time I still feel that I go and see theater in those spaces, and like 1 out of 5 of those things, and it's always kind of been that, is a thing that just completely breaks open my understanding of like what can fall under the auspices of theater. And that for me is the most like, sometimes as an audience member, I'm not like I'm attracted to, I love Richard Nelson's plays and Amy Herzog's plays and Annie Baker's plays, and I love dance. I just went and saw Juliana May's piece at BAM, and I'm like, how have I missed seeing this person's work? And it's dance, but I'm like, oh, this is the kind of theater that I am attracted to. So that kind of cross-pollination, when we went and saw Paul and Gelsey in the Robert Ashley thing, like I'm just like, there's still so much happening, and perhaps they're happening in ways that are different than like how they are being resourced, in the kind of spaces that they're happening in, I'm sure have changed a great deal. But I do feel pretty like grateful for the fact that on any given night in this city, I still feel like we get to go and see a thing that is the
Something
kind of
amazing.
thing, and amazing according to our like sensibilities, which is like, what is this thing? So yeah, I think there's all kinds of like, and like, I think that the folks at Little Island are, like they, have the keys to a highly resourced kingdom and are making all kinds of weird things
stuff
happen there. So I do have a little bit of hope that like the folks that came out of that universe inside of these perhaps more commercial spaces might get to sort of like, mess with those little kingdoms that they now have in different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Misha, for doing this.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks to Hal Round for hosting us, and we hope you'll come see more of Torches.